have this little dog around here. You've seen him. I'm told that if without breeders, dogs would revert back to something like that dog, sort of an dog, and that's the name I have for him, dog. I thought I would read a poem about such a dog who hated the UPS truck and saw himself as protector of our yard and our children. Coach. All trucks were from hell and deserved my bite. All children sheep and not to leave the yard. Before I came, the house was unsafe. The man whistled and no one heard, and the huge truck slumbered. When the boy walked out, ball in hand, I coached. He called me that, Coach. He'd say, and I'd bark back, now, till the game was here, Coach. Fetch, Coach, and I was off and straightway back, unless, of course, one of the trucks from hell passed by. Thrown objects were my specialty, the lazy sticks, their high trajectories, that and the knack I had for words. Here, fetch, hunt, stay, sit, lie down, and names for the boy, his sister. I lived those names 12 years, a diplomat who read the world 4 different ways, nose, ear, eye, and sometimes what was said. When my coat thinned, legs stiffened, and I turned deaf, I was practical. I didn't run, limped wisely over once the stick had plopped. Then the children left as sticks were lost, as the man's whistle rose past hearing, as all sound stopped, and I was nose and eye, watching the trucks from hell roll by, each silent and deserving of my bite, which the last one got till I never let go. And because that dog needs a home, and because last summer about this time, my wife and I were finding homes for kittens and wound up keeping the mother cat, who is admirable in all ways, very smart, part Manx, part Siamese, can do all kinds of things with her paws, stand up a cork, plays pitch with you with a tennis ball, or will roll the cork back and forth, loves to grab rubber bands hanging from knobs and pull them like this. But also she is a serial killer. Anyway, this is Stray, and it's about a cat. Only the very wise know how to sleep in the sun, hunt in the dark, assume what's good, so with their claws they only need, only purr. For those who, driven by that sun each day and fearful of the following dark, barely consider dumb love's generous adoptions. I should add that the other night, driving out to the cross, we saw a timber rattler. Where's Paget? Timber rattler, and Paget was ready to adopt that. This poem ends with a reference to Ravel, who wanted to construct his music around harmony. It's entitled, and that's all you need to know, it's entitled Albumin Silver Print from Glass Negative, Outside Chicago Station, 1887, and it's in 3 sections, and they're different, you'll hear. 1. Ghosts of the late Victorians stare like belief, their stern, stopped mouths covering crooked teeth. The question is, what is it focus yields from faces in a gray, receding field? That dry voluptuousness we call then, now acidly pale, composedly thin? Or only these few half-expectant eyes, arrested in the mute surprise of limb-shattering light and the absolute hushed ballistics of dry leaves underfoot? 2. The train breathes and jolts, full of expectation. The porters scurrying after their charges. Next, goodbyes, waves, 1 second enlarges, the whistle sounding exclamation. Later, a night with a birth and rhythmic sleep, then morning, the Midwest and porters again. Why will Americans believe what's plain as Sunday afternoon, but not the steep unfolding climb up to an altitude rare as the Alps, say, where beauty and war make geographic boundaries the core to a life safe enough for platitudes? And heroes with their simplifying stories, they're seated backward on this train, seeing portraits of themselves forever sliding from view through headlines and hack histories. But of the dozen captured here, it seems, no heroes at all, only grandparents of grandparents, and everyone intent on the next moment. Somewhere a whistle screams. 3. Soil transcends the amateur of beauty, the O's exclamatory duty to praise back into present tense absence more vivid for its distance, as if the uneventful forfeiture caught here by lens and aperture, this telescoping, technically precise, arrested view could splice some small genetic yesterday with now. Restore the hero with the vow he will return, as though return were same and not an arbitrary frame. Or just restore the common everyday of travel, rest, and company. Turn what we lose always to new finding. Make harmony binding the way Ravel imagined it to be. Let landscape trail us musically, and every portrait well taken take light again. That's a plug for Miriam Berkeley's portraits on the wall. Everyone smile when she comes. There she is when she comes around. This is an older poem. The Ferris wheel has one thing I'll mention: 0G. The speaker talks about that. That's the weightlessness you achieve as you go over the top of the curve that you make when you climb steeply and then shove the stick forward. Suddenly it's what you feel on a Ferris wheel. Your stomach rises. Our son used to endure that with great suffering if I did it, but if he did it, everything was all right. We were perfectly safe. The Ferris wheel. The rounding steeps and jostles were one thing, and he held tight with so much circling. Pancaked earth came magnifying up, then shrank as, climbing backward to the top, he looked ahead for something in the fields to stabilize the wheel. Sometimes it stopped. The chairs rocked back and forth as couples holding hands got off and others climbed into the empty chairs. Then they were turning, singles, pairs, rising, falling through everything they saw, whatever thing they saw. Below, the crowd, a holiday of shirts, straw hats, balloons, and brightly colored skirts. So beautiful, he thought, looking down now, while the stubborn wheel ground on as to allow some stark monotony within for those festooned along the rim. The engine, axles, spokes, and gears were rigged so at the top the chairs danced tipsy jigs, a teetering both balanced and extreme. Oh no, the couples cried, laughing. Stop, they screamed. Over the rounding down they rode along, centrifugal and holding on. And he held too, thinking maybe happiness was simply going on, kept up unless the wheel slowed or stopped for good. Otherwise, there were the voices, expectant of surprise. Funny to hear, he thought, their cries, always late, each time the wheel would hesitate. Since the genius of the wheel was accident, the always, almost that hadn't, A minor agony rehearsed as fun, while the lights came up and dark replaced the sun, seeming to complete their going round all day, paying to be turned that way. Later, standing off, he felt the wheel's mild dread, going as though it lapped the miles ahead and rolled them up into the cloudless black, while those who rode accelerated back and up into the night's steep zero-G that proved them free. Let's see. Years ago, someone was asking me about this poem last night, Diane Teal. Years ago, I considered myself, at any rate, a very bad insomniac, a man who suffered more than most. The worry about it was enough to be the cause for it. At a certain point, I ceased to be an insomniac. That ended. Now, I am a man who sits up in a room alone at 2 a.m. and is happy to do so. But this is from before, when I was listening a little too much. Insomnia. Count the number of times boards crack in the cooling house, or furniture plays like a thin percussionist tapping his way, working the bones over and back, a blind man's stick or erratic clock, the door that clicks in its frame as a key which someone works in your lock without forcing it, works patiently. While I'm on that, let's see if I can find one of the things I discovered when our children were a little older was the dread they have as concerning their parents' mortality. So that if they think that maybe you're going to die from staying up until 2 in the morning because someone's coming in that late night after night, if they see me dragging around, that is, the following day and the day after, particularly our daughter, she'll become concerned. And this, of course, now she's married. She didn't pay any attention to me. But in the old days, she would become worried. And next thing you know, she would come in at 1, and then she would come in at midnight, and then maybe even 11:30 or something. And my students had explained to me years before when I said, I talk to my children, tell them what I think they should do. But my lectures go nowhere. They just look at me. And one of my freshmen said, "Look sad." And from that, this, in a very roundabout way, which ends a little more darkly than it begins and is a little bit of a needle for our son. It's entitled Insomnias. And it's based on his inability to go to sleep when he was a little guy. Heard out, then ushered back to bed, he stumped the floor to occupy the door and ask once more, get answered as before that no, they were not aliens. Until he said in a long, high, half-complaining gotcha now, but that's just what they always say. So rules revised, they played the game his way with, how'd you guess? Our home's a star. That's how we saw you. Small eyes enlarged. The ship, they added, takes you if you ever sleep. Years since that, boy, it's hard for them to keep his question in the past before the fact. Aliens inform the innocent act of simply getting up, and neither sleeps. The clocks that cannot say who's coming back, each ribboning day of less duration, extended trips, high church, bright walls, Prozac, the dark nudge inches invitation for the two who always said to sleep, and the grave child who anxiously stays up. That's the son who, when we took him to college and we had to fly, he was so terrified, and we came down out of the clouds and landed, and his mother said, "Oh, well, where are we?" He saw the runway. He said, "I don't care. I'll just go here." have many birds and other forms of wildlife in our yard, and lots of feeders. And until we got the serial killer, we had lots of birds. And I wrote this really sort of in celebration of those birds. It's in two parts. It's called Two Views. 1. Into the laterals and faults of strata, whose linear seams are like memory, water wades its way, settling matters in small aquifers, incised meanders, then floods over a landscape that teaches plains are only so much sediment, silt, the slow ocean of any reach. Think travertine and serpentine mantle high in living rooms, or cames and tills scattered like loose change, the marvelous marble of dolomite and metamorphic rock, or granite, now as coolingly aloof as someday overhead, small seismic self, feeling a gust rattle years through the roof. Meanwhile, there's still the phone and mail, the door, and the reassuring fact the fault's not yours as you've not budged. Not even the cat crosses the floor. Outside, the world's continuum of nests is full of cries announcing difference, while mine shaft down the brittle shale of self waits, certain of its own circumferences. One is colossus of one's growing doubt, with ideas like past presidents profiled and floating enthusiastic shouts from old elections, conclusions of the will, the dehydrations of mere permanence, but high wing overshadow how the world doubles in its transience. 2. Resplendently fragile, more color than weight, as agile of flight as of changed habitat, the birds are choric in the fate of their varieties. Predictable of habit and Darwinian choices, myriad on one scale and on another, essential and of but one in all. And voices, this side liquid whistles followed by a trill, while there a series of clear carolings, then the rapid whinnies of descending will, while somewhere overhead a finch attempts all notes at once, as though to summarize the way limbs ladder up, step green to blue, so shadows rise. But year on year, wing beat and season, fattened or starved, silent or full of migratory sass, one reason brings each back, whether the same or no. Warbler and thrush, sparrow and finch, wren, jay, thrasher, and dove, tanager, waxwing, owl, crow, hawk, they light, feed, breed, migrate, or stay, calendar-wise in their brief histories, and vulnerable as any immigrant searching to eat. They are geographies of days, convergences of now, and needed if for nothing more than their arrival, when, worthy that again we crane to see, they bring survival. I'm going to take a chance here and read something that's new, and just the first part of it, but you'll get the idea. It's titled Nod, which to me could be nodding off to sleep. I haven't tried heroin, so I don't know about that, but it's the land where Cain wound up after murdering his brother. In this case, it also is a parking lot outside Atlanta, Georgia. When in the middle of the afternoon, on a well-marked asphalt parking lot, I came to myself, standing among the SUVs where the yellow lines and exit signs were lost, and where the July heat was oil and wave altering the eye of everything, so overhead the sun looked oxidized, and underneath, moments of silica winked out of a field of black mica. Right then, turning about, seeing so many little lights blinking up from black, I stopped and said, Fulton, just look at it, would you? The gloves are off, but that just means they're scattered on the mat. The entire world has parked and packed it in. Any old fight's better having than having this. This is the flu before the fever touches you, the ache without a place to point, shadows hiding the end of the alley and an entire block of locked back doors. This is the neighborhood of calls for children and dogs who never return, that little land where sleep lies down and no one thinks to wake her up. Bring me back the pounding shoe and the gray Navy flushing Russian submarines. Give me that stretch where longing lives, space shots and Aaron up to bat, black coffee and the small collaterals of penny postcards, pets, T-bills meaning what they say. Steady the hall clock scissoring hands so shirts are buttoned up and down at once and smiles stay fixed at flashbulb best. Give me, in short, a new deck, a fresh cut, another deal, a winning hand, as that's what needs some bringing back. But of course there was no Fulton, as over time the cars all idled off, till I studied the mercury vapor lights, counted the empty parking spots, then addressing Fulton anyways, who's always wandering off somewheres, and me speaking a little too bravely too, just talking a little too much through my summer hat, said to Fulton, said to me, so it begins, my rambling boy. And saying that, I heard a laugh that was a wheeze, that was a cough. As looking round, I saw a coal go bright, go dark, redden, then fade, redden again, then disappear. Some smoker working backwards from his light, thumb to finger, elbow out till arm thrown forward weakly as exaggerated Nixon. He dropped his hand, exhaled, and coughed again, then cleared his throat and pointed with his cigarette. That lot ain't clover, is it, bud? What do you think you're looking for? Not a thing, I said. Thing. A little breath of smoke spoke back. Now that's a category, ain't it, bud? And a fibber of an argument as well. Much like that friend you say you got. What's his name? Fuller, Fulton, Flap? That it? That guy's about as real as Mrs. Thatcher sleeping in the back seat of a Mercury, some choir singing her the hymn of human happiness and misery. Stepping from the door, he stood so's I could see. He had big teeth that made him look to smile, but he didn't smile. Wire glasses, sunken chest, wearing a gray fedora cocked and caved, he stared ahead, but had the backward eyes of someone saying A while thinking B. Nodding, he said, "Wife will tell you." There was the profile of a woman in the tinted window of an old low Mercury. "Wife will tell you everything you'll ever sing, friend. Then how it is you will forget the words, so make some up and whistle round till you have fumbled back to where you started out. But look you now. You out of cash, bump your noggin, forget your number, need a lift? That's me. I'm in security. I make the calls. I know what holds. Fire doors and double locks. There's nothing like a blaze one side and on the other the breathable air of reliable escape. So step this way. Use any name you like. Just look about and net you up a list of wants. The shops are thinning out, so now there's room to see what gives you appetite. Next, he was battling a double door till stepping back, he said, "Just look you here. Look about. I know this stretch the way I know that modesty shoplifters use when touching things they mean to take. Clothes under signs announcing sales, or items on less prominent displays. Same as I know that shopper's ways beside the fitting room where going in all baggy clothes, she marches back fleshed out with 10 pounds off the rack. I know the stolen cards, stiff-kneed walk from store to store, some idiot kid thinking to beat the call that trips the lights. And I know that kind of idleness that hesitates, then lifts and makes a comic break. That is my business, knowing the want that waits, like sly forgetfulness, caged innocence." He doesn't sound too nice, does he? But never you mind my talking shops, they're always better when the folks are out. So just you stand right there, and if you can, get that cartoon Fulton in here too. I have a call to make. And so what next? I look just like he said I ought. But who is it ever starts the way he ought and doesn't wind up doing something other? One leg complains, the next one gets the weight, and off you go balancing that either or of now to next and left to right. And that is how I made my way, as on my right there was a store with compasses, no maps and lamps, no books, carpets but no furniture, and next to these a window full of clocks announcing different times, and under those recliners like exhausted yawns. And on my left there were bookstores and cooking stores, wine shops and shops for shoes, hats, outing gear, more shoes, more hats, gimmick bathroom scales and telephones, bird baths, bird feeders, wall thermometers, fake antique radios, air purifiers, one pet store where two Scotties barked, and either side of those a slow aquarium, fish circling so as you watched the colors ran left to right, then right to left, and over these an ornate cage strung from the ceiling holding the day's bright birds folded for the night. And then that laugh, that wheeze, that cough was back, tapping the smoke against his watch until he thumbed a match and without looking brought it up. "Who's to remember," he said, "who's to remember a nickel or a dime, or even the time you saw your little dog get hit? And how you think you know my dog was hit? I'm saying you were 6, the dog was 4, maybe 5, just saying that, nothing more. No, but it rolled, didn't it? Stood, then rolled, looked, searching you to breathe, and what I think you thought that animal was thinking then was what I like to call that lethal lack of hope, seen in tired motels, slumped waiting rooms, discarded magazines, cufflinks, and watches with initials no one now knows how to read." He stalled on that, studied his shoes, then started up again. "Children and pets," he said, gazing to some mid-air vacancy. "Those and the pleasure of mockingbirds and attic fans going on all night. But too, plagues and wars, bank runs and losing seasons, brilliant crashes, knuckled wrecks. Sometimes I hear the entire chorus in the white noise of my central air." He stopped again, dropped his smoke, looked down, towed it flat, then nodded toward a mannequin, blue blazer, yachting cap, faceless head tilted up to nothing. "Some guy wants to tell me how a heart gets full, give reason why a soldier can't go home, the world too big to fit his rearview mirror, some such. I say, don't waste your needle on that thread. It never knots and the wool won't hold. Besides, you bundle up because it's cold. You're only living in the cold." "It's July 3, I said. "We're standing in a mall outside Atlanta, Georgia. It's after dark and no one's thinking anything but heat. Just ask your wife out in that parking lot, stuck waiting in that cashed-in car you've got." Settle, he said, palms to my face. "You're right about the car. Cashed in for sure. And running rough. And wife out there, well now, just ask her what a word like rough might mean. But to our situation here, these stores, you hold a map and phone book side by side, you're any place you please. They're all the same. Miami to Chicago as Boston to L.A. You've got your size, they got your fit." After that, he lifted his hat, looked over his glasses, eyebrows up, then let the hat drop back and said, "All the news I have to tell you is I've been to sea, steamed through the hurricane, survived a wreck, and floated the salt waves for 3 days, shoveled a forest fire, sandbagged a flood, delivered my daughter on the kitchen table while the doctor talked me through by telephone, watched a twister swallow my house, lived on either coast and parts between, and these and more leave me to tell you for a certain fact that of all the places that I've ever been, well, this is one of them." Then he was searching his pockets and taking his time, till looking round and speaking almost shyly, he said, "You know, my honest name is Byram Thatch, but no one's ever called me anything but Floyd." So, there you are. Yeah, clap. Thank you. It's late in the game. I'll read a poem entitled Marooned, and I'll read a poem entitled A Child's Christmas in Georgia. And I think I'll read A Child's Christmas first. A woman who had a lot to do with raising me, named Henrietta Winfrey, left Athens, Georgia, where she graduated in the top of her class, although that was, the days of segregation. That would have been in the 1930s. She went to New York, lived in Brooklyn, was married to a merchant marine who was a chief in the merchant marines, and she had a very good life. But he became an alcoholic and and her mother fell ill, and so she decided she had to come back to Athens, Georgia. And as she once said to me of her marriage, Wyatt, when the money went, Henrietta went too. And she was fond of saying, well, she had a joke that she liked to tell. She had two things. She said, if I ever get clear, I'm leaving if I ever get clear. She meant if she ever could settle affairs for her mother and her sister. She also had a joke she loved to tell about a baby, a woman who stays pregnant indefinitely, and finally the baby's old enough to speak for himself, and he sticks his head out and says, I'm not coming out in Georgia. So it was a college town, and you lived within an academic community where you knew one thing, and my father had taught other places. And then on the other hand, you lived in the surround 1950s in Georgia and in the world that existed then of a lot of separation and potential violence. There's mention in here of the Talmadges. There was Eugene Talmadge, who was governor of Georgia, and at one point ran for governor against his son Herman, who was later senator. And Eugene Talmadge died before he could be sworn in. Herman had finished second in the election. So he said he should be governor, and he occupied the governor's mansion, never mind the lieutenant governor. And he was talked out of that eventually. So there's mention of that family. There was a song marching through Georgia that Sherman's troops sang. This is a little boy who hears things and gets them wrong. And what else is in here? There are a couple of things at the end that I think speak for themselves. It's also a time when Delta Airlines was just getting started. Delta was going to go to Birmingham, Alabama, but the mayor of Atlanta said, we will waive any gasoline tax if you come to Atlanta. So Delta started. The company had been a crop dusting company in the 1930s in Louisiana. But when they bought a bunch of DC-3s and wanted to be air carriers, and so they were enticed to come to Atlanta, and that made, as you all know, quite a difference. So this is A Child's Christmas in Georgia, 1953, and obviously it's my rejoinder to somebody else's vision of Christmas. And the thing that made me write it was the mystery to me, why when everybody is supposed to be so happy around Christmas, a lot of times people are not. So that was the question I was trying to answer. Marching through Georgia to bed, he stopped, listened, and heard while shepherds washed their socks by night. Later he sang the same skewed line off key, and his parents howled, until getting it wrong, he decided, beat getting it right. But Christmas Eve they read about killing the firstborn, fleeing the land and returning by another country, till he couldn't sleep and had to check, so slipped from bed to stare the darkened height by which the wise men steered. Downstairs there were his mother's stacks of albums, and mantle high her unblinking gallery of gold-framed gray beards gazing, and matriarchs in black scowling the generations back into place. And then there were the others, his infant older brother who never came home, two cousins lost in war, an uncle who captained his ship over the flat world's edge, and one fleece-lined pilot lost years now inside the stilled weather of a relative's box camera. And then there were the lines he had heard in church, pray that your flight may not be in winter. So that was how the pilot disappeared. And woe to the pregnant and nursing. So that explained his brother or their mother. There was one thing he knew by heart by now. Rubella cooked, cleaned, and scolded her way through the house, tuning the news and talking back, though she didn't vote, and said her baby died because he wouldn't come out in Georgia. Still standing there and staring up, he pressed his face till the cold glass fogged and hurt his nose, though there was only the street light yellowing the side yard and his father's dormant garden and the Talmadge's coiled drive and empty house. So what were they singing about? The records and radio. And why all these presents when over drinks his parents grieved those missing? What was given if you had to go away and wound up framed like a silent question? In the morning, Rubella would light the stove. The paper boy would whistle up millage, tossing the new day high over one hedge into another by the porch for parents who ignored their food and read to themselves. So, still at the window, he studied the sky, figuring Pontius Pilate flew for Delta, and that the two parts to the Bible were the Old and New Testaments, which, like Christmas, you read out of the names of those missing. Marooned, with a little help from Charles Darwin here. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small group of birds, one might fancy that from an original paucity, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. You want me to say hello? All right, here we go. Marooned. But for the one marooned, all limits have reversed. So now the ocean's hourglass washes sand from underfoot, wave after wave, and days allied and word may never pass over that fixed horizon of great risk. The signal fires burn out, bottles drift back. In time, the lost forget that which they miss, as all the imitations that they make of civilized survival fail unnoticed under the blank domes of day following day. And this is how identity is erased, not in the violent wreck, but in the way time runs without exception or an end, limitless to exhume the days from years, as though return were how the world begins and this one doesn't ever. All those fears one carries into sleep, vivid for dark, and the contrast of waking memory, now told, forget, like island birds whose marks reduplicate their mainland history, but never going back, go on with all. That is the order of it, the going through. That double mind and nothing in the all continuing but what you see from you, horizon round, blank, staring blue, ocean and sky, and you wondering why such things happen. They simply do. So next time someone new will wave goodbye, isolate species with no ship coming round. Yet of those changeful birds blown in by storms, frail colonials agreed to common ground. They fly freely and by surprising forms. And that's it. It's 5 o'clock.